September 20th, 1941. Noon. But it was an unreal, ghostly noon, filtered through the dense green canopy of old oaks that crowded a dead-end railway spur somewhere in a forest west of Kyiv. The air here was thick, motionless, filled with the smell of decaying leaves, iron rust, and the acrid, stale sweat of 46 men locked inside the steel box of the light armored train BP-7. For 12 days now, they had not been soldiers. They were ghosts. Their world had become a few armor-plated railcars. Their god was their commander, Lieutenant Dmitry Orlov, and their universe was this very silence. A silence stretched taut as a string, ready to snap at any moment from the crack of a twig under a foreign boot or the distant, hateful drone of a reconnaissance plane. Orlov stood at the commander's periscope where the same landscape trembled and blurred. Tree trunks, leaves, a meager patch of sky. He wasn't looking. He was listening. Listening to the silence, trying to catch a false note in it, a harbinger of death. His face, once young and full of a commander's confidence, had become a gray mask of exhaustion, stretched tight over bone. His eyes were sunken, dark circles lying beneath them, but in their very depths burned a cold, unquenchable fire, the fire of will, which alone kept this all afloat. The railcar was in near complete darkness, with only thin rays of light piercing the viewing slits, painting the semblance of prison bars on the soot-stained walls and the faces of the men. The men sat and lay in their places, resembling dark shadows. They had learned to conserve everything: food, water, words, movements, even their breath. By day, the armored train froze, becoming a pile of iron dusted with branches and leaves merging with the forest. At night, it came alive. The heavy panting of the locomotive, muffled to a whisper by the skilled hands of the engineer, the creak of wheels stealing along abandoned tracks, and the short, furious blasts of fire erupting from its gun turrets somewhere near a careless enemy. Rear station, they were hunters whose season began at sunset. They hunted for coal, water, canned food, shells, for everything that allowed them to live another day, another night in this hell. The 26th hour without water. A taste of rust and dust filled their mouths. Their lips were cracked. Every swallow was a stab of pain in the throat. Sergeant Ignat Zubov, a tall, bony man with a face carved from the granite of despair, slowly ran his tongue over his dry lips and rasped into the silence, addressing no one and everyone at once. "We're finished, Lieutenant. Like rats in a trap." Orlov didn't turn. His voice sounded muffled, like a hammer striking an anvil. "Silence, Zubov. Tonight there will be water. And food." Zubov smirked, but there was no mirth in it, only the bitterness of wormwood. "And what if there isn't? What if they're waiting for us? They're not idiots. They know we're somewhere around here. Soon they'll be checking every bush." His words held a sticky, contagious truth that everyone present felt in their gut. They were a splinter in the enemy's flesh, and the flesh was beginning to feel the irritation. It was starting to produce antibodies, patrols, reconnaissance, ambushes. Orlov slowly detached himself from the periscope and turned to the crew. In the gloom, his eyes seemed like two burning coals. "As long as I'm alive, there will be water, and there will be food, and there will be order. Anyone who disagrees can leave. Right now. The forest is large, but no one who leaves will come back." He scanned the faces of the soldiers, lingering on each one as if hammering his will into them. No one moved. They were a single organism, albeit a sick, exhausted, but still living one. And the heart of that organism was him, Lieutenant Orlov. And as long as his heart was beating, they would fight. But to understand how the elite crew of an armored train, the pride of the Southwestern Front, had turned into a pack of ghosts living in a steel tomb in the middle of enemy territory, one must go back 12 days to that clear and deceptively calm day of September 8th, when their world collapsed forever. The 8th of September, 1941. turned out to be surprisingly quiet and warm. The sun bathed the endless fields of sunflowers, which had already bowed their heavy heads to the earth, in golden light. The air was saturated with the bittersweet aroma of wilting greenery and the distant, barely perceptible smell of burning, which had already become a familiar backdrop for everything living on this land. The light armored train BP-7, painted in a protective green, rolled slowly, almost lazily, along the single track, slicing through this sea of sunflowers. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels was lulling, creating an illusion of normalcy, as if they were not at war, but on a routine freight run. Inside the armored cars, however, a different atmosphere reigned. It smelled of hot metal, gun oil, and makorka, a crude, strong tobacco. The soldiers not on duty were engaged in their usual routines. Some were cleaning their personal weapons, some were playing cards, some were simply dozing, leaning against the sun-warmed armor. 19-year-old Private Alyosha Vorobyov, the radio operator, sat with his ear pressed to the headphones, listening to the crackle and hiss of the ether, trying to catch familiar call signs. His face was still boyish, with peach fuzz above his upper lip, and his blue eyes had not yet been inhabited by the deep sorrow that had long since taken up residence in the gazes of his older comrades. He still believed in the communiques from the Soviet Information Bureau, in the inviolability of the front line, and in a swift victory. Sergeant Ignat Zubov, watching him from his corner, just smirked crookedly. Zubov was one of those whom the war had aged beyond his years. He had fought in the Winter War, had known the taste of encirclement and the bitterness of retreat. He didn't believe the newspapers. He believed his eyes, and his eyes saw endless columns of refugees on the roads and heard the incessant roar of cannon fire, which day by day crept closer from the east, though it was supposed to be thundering in. The West. Lieutenant Orlov was in the command cabin, bent over a map. He was strict, taciturn, and kept to himself. The crew respected and feared him. It was rumored that near Vyazma he had personally shot a panic monger, and although no one knew if it was true, the story created an aura of unbending, steely resolve around the lieutenant. He traced a pencil across the map, marking stations, bridges, and junctions. His task was simple: to guard the rear communications, patrolling a designated sector, ensuring the safe passage of supply trains. A routine, almost boring job far from the front lines. But something had been troubling Orlov in recent days. The airwaves were growing quieter. Contact with the headquarters of the division to which they were attached was becoming more and more erratic. The reports they managed to receive were vague and contradictory. There was a sense of disaster in the air, a great, inevitable disaster. That day, they received their last order. It was short, businesslike, and portended nothing unusual. Proceed to the Fastov 2 station, conduct additional reconnaissance of the railway bridge over the Unava River, and report on the situation. A task for a few hours. Prepare to move out, Orlov barked into the internal communication tube, and the armored train, which had been slumbering on a forest siding, lazily came to life. Steam hissed, the engineer gave a short whistle, and the steel behemoth moved out, making its way to the main line. The sun was already setting, painting the sky in crimson tones. The soldiers spilled out onto the open platforms, greedily inhaling the fresh evening air. Starshina Petrovich, an old career soldier who also served as the crew's soul and keeper of an endless supply of tall tales, looked at the sunset sky and grumbled, "The sky is washing itself with blood. It's a bad omen." No one paid his words any mind. They were on their way to carry out an order. They were a force. Behind them, they believed, stood the entire might of the Red Army. None of them knew yet that behind them there was nothing but a void. The front, which they considered an unshakable wall, was already cracking at the seams, about to crumble into dust. That evening, as Lieutenant Orlov inspected the guns, he thought for the last time of home, of the wife and daughter he had left in Rostov. He did not suspect that the thunder he would hear in a few hours would not be a distant cannonade, but the sound of a giant trap snapping shut, a trap in which they were destined to be left alone with the enemy and their own despair. The journey to the Fastov 2 station was uneventful. Twilight was gathering when BP-7, slowing down, cautiously approached the bridge. Everything was calm. A small guard detachment was on duty at the bridge. The soldiers emerged from their shelter waving cheerfully. Orlov received the report. All clear. No enemy in sight. Traffic over the bridge was proceeding normally. He transmitted a short message to headquarters. Objective is clear. Returning to base. In response, silence. Orlov called headquarters again. And again. The ether was dead. It was strange. An alarm bell, still quiet, rang in his mind. "Turn us around," he ordered. The armored train, puffing steam, slowly chugged back in the opposite direction. Night fell quickly, wrapping the land in a warm velvet blanket. Bright stars lit up in the sky. It seemed as if nature itself was trying to calm them, to lull their vigilance. They had traveled no more than 10 kilometers, about 6.2 miles, when it happened. Ahead, about 500 meters, roughly 1640 feet away, the ground erupted, and a deafening explosion tore the night's silence. A pillar of fire shot up towards the stars, illuminating the surroundings with a gruesome orange light. The blast wave slammed into the armored train, making its multi-ton body shudder. "Stop! Brakes!" Orlov yelled into the tube. With a screech and a groan, the train halted. The soldiers jumped to their feet, clutching their weapons. What was it? An air raid? Sabotage? And then, as if in answer to their unspoken questions, a second, equally powerful explosion thundered behind them at about the same distance. They were trapped. The way forward and the way back were cut off. A ringing silence fell, even more terrifying than the roar of the explosions. In that silence, each man could hear only the beating of his own heart. "Radio? Contact headquarters? Now!" Orlov's voice cut through the stupor. Alyosha Vorobyov, his trembling hands gripping the tuning knobs, desperately twisted them, listening to the dead hiss. "Nothing, Comrade Lieutenant. No one's on the air. Complete silence." There were tears in his voice. Orlov grabbed his binoculars and pressed them to a viewing slit. For several minutes he silently stared into the darkness, trying to see something. And he saw it. Far on the horizon, in the direction where their rear should have been, the sky was illuminated by a dim, ominous glow. And against that glow, dots flickered. Signal flares. Green, red. Not ours. Theirs. And then the realization hit him, cold, like the blade of a knife plunged into his very heart. This wasn't sabotage. This wasn't a raid behind the lines. This was a breakthrough. A deep, massive one. The front hadn't just been breached. The front was gone. It had collapsed. And they, the light armored train BP-7, were not in their own rear, but deep, bottomlessly deep, in the enemy's. All around them for hundreds of kilometers was now enemy territory. They were an island in a raging ocean. A tiny steel island that no one knew about and for which no help would come. He lowered the binoculars. His face in the gloom of the cabin seemed carved from stone. "Full speed ahead, slowly. Up to the blast site," he ordered the engineer. The train moved cautiously and a few minutes later bumped into the mangled crater, at the bottom of which lay rails torn out by the roots. The picture was clear. The track was professionally destroyed. It couldn't be repaired quickly. He looked at his men. On their faces were shock, fear, incomprehension. They were waiting for his command. Their lives now depended on him. And in that moment, he understood. If they were to survive, he had to become more than just their commander. He had to become their law, their hope, and if necessary, their executioner. He had to tear the fear and despair from their hearts and replace it with a cold, calculated fury. "Listen to my command." His voice was calm, but in that calmness was the hardness of tempered steel. "The front is gone. We are surrounded. There's no contact with our forces, and there won't be. From this moment on, we are not a patrol train. We are a partisan detachment. Our home is this train. Our mission is to survive and to inflict maximum damage on the enemy. The laws of wartime are hereby rescinded. From now on, my laws are in effect, and the first law is no panic. The first 24 hours passed in a state bordering on anarchy. The realization of the catastrophe crashed down on the crew like a ton of explosives. The old, familiar world with its regulations, orders, headquarters, and front lines had ceased to exist. All around was only hostile uncertainty. Inside the steel compartments of the armored train, frozen between two craters, a sticky, suffocating fear took hold. It seeped through the armor along with the night chill. It crunched on their teeth with a cheap makorka. It was a lump in their throats, making it hard to breathe. It was stuffy inside the cars. The smell of sweat, iron, and despair had condensed to the point where it felt like you could cut it with a knife. The worst part was the silence. Not the silence they were used to during stops, but the dead, absolute silence of a world where they had become aliens. Somewhere out there, beyond their steel shell, a different alien life was going on. German vehicles drove by, German soldiers talked, dogs barked in the nearby villages, and they sat in this iron box, like in a submarine lying on the seabed, afraid to make a single sound. The first to break was a young machine gunner. He leaped up, his eyes darting madly around the dark car. "I don't want to die here! We have to leave! Ditch this tin can and run for the forest! Try to get back to our lines!" His cry, full of animal terror, was a detonator. Several other men supported him. Chaos erupted. Men jumped to their feet, shouting, interrupting each other. The voice of despair found its leader in Sergeant Zubov. "He's right, Lieutenant. We're a sitting duck here. In the morning their Rama will fly over and will be nothing but a grease spot. We have to leave before it's too late." Orlov was silent. He let the panic spill out, let fear show its face. He stood motionless, and his calmness against the backdrop of the general hysteria seemed unnatural. When the shouting began to subside, he spoke without raising his voice, but each of his words drove into their consciousness like a nail. "Where will you go?" "To our lines." "And where are they?" "Our lines." 100 kilometers, about 62 miles away. 200, about 124 miles. "Do you know the way?" "Without maps, without food, without water. You'll be picked off one by one on the first day. But this train, this tin can as you call it, is our armor, our weapon, our home. If we stay together, we have a chance. If we scatter, we're all doomed." He swept his gaze over the mutineers. "I'm not holding anyone. Whoever wants to leave, the door is open. But remember this, anyone who leaves this train is a deserter. And if I find him, I will shoot him on sight. That is my law." Silence fell. No one moved. He had won. But this was only the first battle. Trials far more terrible awaited them. He ordered an immediate inventory of everything they had. Junior Lieutenant Boris Kovalyov, a quiet, inconspicuous man, who until that moment had dealt exclusively with the technical condition of the train, proved to be indispensable. With a notebook and pencil, he went through all the cars, counting and recording everything down to the last bullet, the last can of stewed meat. The figures he reported to Orlov an hour later were depressing. There was enough ammunition for the main caliber guns for 1 or 2 serious engagements, a little more for the machine guns, rations for 3 or 4 days of strict economy. But the most terrifying thing was the water. In the locomotive's cistern, there was enough water for only a few hours of engine operation. In their canteens, there was no more than a day's supply of drinking water. They were a fortress, but a fortress whose well was running dry. By the morning of the first day, thirst had become their primary enemy. The sun beat down mercilessly. The air inside the cars became scorching. The men lay in a state of apathy, licking their parched lips. Orlov imposed the strictest rationing, 1 sip of water every 3 hours. It was torture. It seemed it was all over. They would die of thirst in the middle of these endless fields without ever firing a single shot. Zubov raised his head again. "Well, Commander, where is your promised water? In the sky?" Orlov remained silent, staring at the map. He was looking for a solution, and he found one. A few kilometers away, a small river was marked on the map with a thin blue line. But how to get to it? At night, they repaired the damaged section of track using spare rails they always carried with them. It was hellish work in complete darkness with almost no tools. But they managed. Now they could move. The problem was different. How to approach the river unnoticed and how to pump water into the locomotive's huge tanks. And that's when the quiet junior Lieutenant Kovalyov, whom everyone considered just a techie, uttered words that were both a salvation and madness. "Comrade Lieutenant, we have fire hoses and the locomotive's pump." Kovalyov's idea was brilliant in its simplicity and suicidal in its audacity. The plan was to bring the armored train as close as possible to the river under the cover of darkness, stopping in the forest belt that ran alongside the railway tracks. Then, using all available fire hoses connected into one long main, they would reach the water. And then came the most dangerous part. They would have to turn on the locomotive's pump, which, even at low revs, made a distinctive sound, clearly audible in the night silence. It was Russian roulette. If they were heard, they would become a perfect, stationary target. But there was no other way out. The preparation took the entire next day. While the main part of the crew languished from thirst in the stuffy cars, Kovalyov and two assistants worked on the pump, trying to make it run as quietly as possible. They wrapped it in every rag they could find, greased all the connections with solid oil. It looked like a shamanic ritual to appease an evil spirit. As darkness fell, the operation began. The armored train, moving at the slowest possible speed, almost silently, like a large predatory beast, crept up to the designated point. The river was about 300 meters, nearly 1,000 feet away. 10 men, including Orlov and Kovalyov, slipped out dragging the heavy canvas hoses. The night forest met them with a hostile silence. Every crack of a twig underfoot sounded like a gunshot. Every rustle of leaves made their hearts stop. They worked in complete darkness, by feel, passing sections of the main to one another. Sweat blinded their eyes, mosquitoes swarmed their faces, but no one made a sound. Finally, the end of the hose with a heavy filter on it splashed into the cool river water. A signal was passed down the chain to the train. The moment of truth had arrived. Kovalyov stood at the pump lever. His face was white with tension. He looked at Orlov. The lieutenant nodded silently. With a sinking heart, Kovalyov turned the lever. A muffled, chugging, sucking sound was heard. It seemed incredibly loud. It felt to the entire crew as if it could be heard for tens of kilometers around. Everyone froze, listening to the night. A minute passed. 2. 5. Nothing. Only the chirping of crickets and the distant bark of a dog, and the steady, guttural gurgle of the pump, pumping life into their dying steel fortress. The water came slowly. The long main created a lot of resistance. An hour passed, then another. The men who remained on the train stood by the open hatches of the cistern, listening to the water level slowly rise. That sound was better than any music. It was the sound of hope. They had pumped the tank almost full when the roar of an engine was heard from the direction of the highway, which ran a couple of kilometers, just over a mile, away. It was getting closer. Orlov, who was on watch, peered through his binoculars. A German patrol armored car. It was moving slowly, its searchlight beam sweeping the roadsides. "Shut off the pump. Everyone to cover," Orlov whispered. The pump fell silent. The scouts froze in the bushes, blending in with the ground. The armored car approached the crossing and stopped. The searchlight beam slid through the forest for a moment, illuminating the side of the armored train hidden among the trees. Everyone's heart was in their throat, but the Germans apparently noticed nothing. After waiting for another minute, the armored car turned around and drove back. The danger had passed. They had won. This was their first victory over circumstance. A victory achieved not by force of arms, but by the power of engineering, courage, and discipline. When the scouts returned to the train, they were greeted as heroes. That day, there were no restrictions on water. People drank, washed, simply stood under the stream pouring from the hose and laughed. It was euphoric. They realized they were not doomed. They realized they could fight. For the first time in many days, there was hope in their eyes, and their respect for Junior Lieutenant Kovalyov, the quiet genius, became boundless. He had become their unexpected savior. But this victory had a downside. They had left traces, trampled grass, damp earth. They had defeated thirst, but they had drawn attention to themselves. The hostile environment in which they found themselves had sensed their presence. The hunt had not yet begun, but the hounds had already picked up the scent. The first victory breathed new life into the crew. Apathy and despair were replaced by a focused, angry determination. They had survived the first skirmish, which meant they could survive the next. Under the leadership of Lieutenant Orlov, the armored train began to transform from a trapped victim into an autonomous combat unit, a small state on wheels with its own laws, its own economy, and its own army. Orlov proved to be a brilliant organizer. He understood that in their situation the most important things were system and discipline. He developed a strict daily routine that became sacred to them. Day meant absolute silence and camouflage. The train was driven into the deepest forest dead end or onto an abandoned spur of an old factory. From the outside, it was covered with nets, strewn with branches and leaves, turning it into something vaguely resembling a green hill. Any sounds were strictly forbidden. They spoke in whispers. They moved through the cars on tiptoe. No smoking. The day was a time for sleep, weapon cleaning, and planning. Night was a time for life and war. With the onset of darkness, the armored train came alive. Orlov, Kovalyov, and Starshina Petrovich, an old railwayman who knew the area like the back of his hand, would spend hours poring over the map, which had become their most prized possession. They studied the railway network, marking small stations, junctions, and warehouses where, according to their calculations, the enemy might be present and, more importantly, where supplies could be found. Kovalyov, who turned out to be not only an engineer but also a talented analyst, learned to determine the importance of a particular station by subtle signs: the thickness of the smoke from the chimneys, the number of cars on the sidings, the ETA, intensity of traffic. They created their own intelligence service. Every night, several of the most agile and daring soldiers went out on foot reconnaissance, sneaking up to the designated objectives, observing, memorizing, counting. Based on their reports, Orlov would decide on a raid. The raids themselves were works of military art. The tactic was simple and effective: surprise, maximum firepower, and a lightning-fast withdrawal. The armored train would burst into a station at full speed without lights. For a few minutes, a storm of fire from all its cannons and machine guns would be unleashed on the sleepy, relaxed Germans. While the guards were recovering from the shock, a special assault group would disembark, seize what they needed: sacks of flour, boxes of canned food, and most importantly, coal and water, and return to the train just as quickly. 5 to 7 minutes after the attack began, the armored train would be gone. It would dissolve into the night, leaving behind fires, panic, and corpses. Their life fell into a harsh but predictable rhythm. Day, waiting. Night, hunting. They learned to live in this world. They became a part of it. They turned into nocturnal predators, into the ghost train, as the Germans nicknamed them in their radio intercepts, which Alyosha Vorobyov now regularly monitored. This growing organization and their successes gave the men more than just the physical resources for survival. It gave them something more, a sense of purpose. They were not just hiding and surviving. They were fighting. They were taking revenge. Every derailed German train, every burned warehouse was their personal contribution to a war they no longer knew anything about, but which they continued to wage. Orlov was finally established as the undisputed authority, almost a deity. His orders were not questioned. His word was law. He had established a dictatorship, but it was a dictatorship that was saving their lives. The slightest breach of discipline, stealing food, sleeping on duty, defeatist talk, was met with harsh punishment. He was a surgeon who did not hesitate to amputate a gangrenous limb to save the whole organism, and the crew accepted this cruelty because they understood its necessity. Their empire lived and grew stronger. But not everyone was ready to live by the laws of this new, harsh world. In a dark corner of the gun car, in the stuffy atmosphere of gunpowder fumes and human sweat, a rebellion began to brew. And its heart was the same Sergeant Ignat Zubov, whose pragmatic pessimism no amount of success could overcome. He considered all this a death agony, a postponement of the inevitable end, and he was waiting for his moment to say it out loud. Zubov was not a coward. He was a realist whose soul had been scorched clean by the war, leaving only the bitter ashes of cynicism. He had seen too much death and defeat to believe in a miracle. Every successful raid, every scavenged bag of flour in his eyes, was merely a stay of execution. He saw how, with each passing day, the Germans were becoming more organized. Their patrols were more frequent, the security at stations was strengthened. He understood that the ghost train game could not last long. Soon, a real hunt would begin for them, and then their little fortress on wheels would turn into a steel grave. His boiling point was reached when Orlov announced the plan for a new operation, an attack on a major railway hub where, according to intelligence, a train with aviation fuel was stationed. It was a daring, almost suicidal idea. The hub was protected by a serious garrison. The risk was enormous, but the prize for victory was high: to create a gigantic fire in the enemy's deep rear. That evening, as Orlov was laying out his plan, Zubov stood up. His tall, bony figure rose in the gloom of the car like an ominous specter. "Have you gone completely mad, Lieutenant?" His voice was quiet, but it had the ring of steel. "This is certain death. We go in there, and they'll crush us like bugs. We've already done the impossible. We've survived. Maybe it's time to stop playing heroes. Maybe it's time to think about saving our own skins." Orlov looked at him with a cold, hard gaze. "Are you suggesting we surrender, Zubov?" "I'm suggesting we live!" Zubov shouted, all his accumulated despair breaking through. "We need to take what we can carry, blow this coffin to hell, and scatter into the forests. In small groups we have a chance to make it to our lines or at least survive until winter. But your attacks, this is madness. You're leading us to the slaughter." His words fell on fertile ground. Fatigue, constant tension, fear of death, all of this lived in the soul of every man. Several men supported Zubov, murmuring in agreement. The air smelled of mutiny. This was the most serious test for Orlov. Now he was facing not an external enemy but an enemy within. The voice of their own weakness and fear embodied in the figure of the sergeant. Orlov didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He did what no one expected. He walked right up to Zubov and said quietly, "All right, Sergeant. Let's say you're right. We abandon the train. What then? Will you lead the men? Do you know where to go? Do you know how to feed 40 hungry mouths in a land scorched by war? Do you know how to treat the sick and wounded without medicine? Are you prepared to take responsibility for the life of every single one of them?" Zubov was silent, his jaw clenched. Orlov continued, his voice growing firmer. "But I do. I know that as long as we are united, as long as we have this armor and these guns, we are a force. We aren't just surviving, we are fighting. But if we split up, we'll become a pack of stray dogs that will be shot one by one. Yes, the risk is enormous. Yes, we may all die. But we will die as soldiers, in battle, not starve to death in a swamp. Choose." He stepped back and stood under a dim lamp. "Whoever is for Sergeant Zubov's proposal, take one step forward." No one moved. Even those who had supported him a minute ago stood with their heads bowed. His cold, iron logic had defeated the emotional outburst of despair. He had defended his law. The mutiny was crushed before it began. Zubov stood alone, defeated and empty. At that moment, from above the forest where they were hiding came a familiar, hated sound. The rattling drone of the engine of a Focke-Wulf, a German reconnaissance plane the soldiers called the Rama, or frame. Everyone froze, looking up. The plane made one circle, then a second, passing directly over them. They could almost physically feel the attentive, cold gaze of the aerial camera lens on them. While they were arguing amongst themselves, while their will was paralyzed by internal conflict, their real enemy, faceless and methodical, had found them. The Rama dipped its wings as if in farewell and headed west. Everyone understood what it meant. They had been found. Now it was a matter of hours. They were coming for them. And they wouldn't be coming empty-handed. From that moment on, their life turned into an endless cat-and-mouse game with death. Orlov knew that staying put was suicide. The Germans knew their grid square, and soon they would bring in forces to sweep the forest or simply launch a bombing raid. They had to move. But where? The railway network, which had once been their universe, had now become a labyrinth where every corridor could be a trap. The plan to attack the hub was cancelled. The main task now was survival. They changed their location every night, never staying in the same place for more than a day. During the day, they camouflaged themselves desperately, listening to the sky. Aviation became their main nightmare. Almost every day, reconnaissance planes or light attack aircraft flew over them. The soldiers would freeze in their cars, not daring to breathe, praying to all the gods that they wouldn't be noticed. One day, a plane flew so low they could see the pilot's face in the cockpit. He looked right at them but apparently saw nothing suspicious in the green mound in the middle of the forest. But luck couldn't last forever. The Germans, infuriated by the daring raids of the ghost train, began a targeted hunt. They started blowing up small bridges, blocking junctions, creating obstructions on the tracks. The space for maneuver was relentlessly shrinking. Orlov could feel the ring closing in. They were trapped on a small 20-kilometer, roughly 12.5-mile stretch of track, with destroyed bridges at both ends. It was a mousetrap. September 19th was their last day of relative calm. Early in the morning, a scout party sent to the nearest station returned with alarming news. Several trucks with infantry and 2 light tanks had arrived at the station. It was obvious. A sweep was being prepared. There was no more time. Orlov gathered everyone. His face was calm, but there was such determination in his eyes that no one had any doubt. He had already made his decision. "They're coming for us," he said simply. "There's nowhere left to hide. We can't run. So, we will make our stand. Here, at this crossing." He pointed to a spot on the map. An ordinary, unremarkable crossing surrounded by forest on one side and an open field on the other. "They will come down the road. We will meet them here, head on. We have the element of surprise. They think we'll be hiding, but we will attack them first." It was madness to engage in open battle with a superior enemy force, but it was the only honorable solution. They prepared for battle all day. They checked the guns, loaded the machine gun belts, prepared grenades. The men worked in silence with concentration. There was no more fear, only a dull, cold fury. They wrote letters that would never be sent. They said goodbye to each other without words, only with glances. In the evening, the armored train took its position, hidden in the forest near the crossing. The soldiers took their places according to the battle roster. Orlov stood at the periscope. Next to him, Junior Lieutenant Kovalyov prepared to direct the artillery fire. In another car, Sergeant Zubov, silent and grim, set up a Maxim machine gun in an embrasure. All his rebellion, all his despair, was gone. Only a soldier's duty remained. They waited. The night was dark and moonless. The silence pressed on their ears. And then, far down the road, The dim lights of headlights appeared. They were getting closer. One vehicle, a second, a third. A column. "Prepare," Orlov whispered. The column slowly crawled onto the crossing. A tank was in the lead, followed by trucks with infantry. "Fire!" Orlov's voice cracked like a whip, and all hell broke loose. The train's 76mm cannon fired at point-blank range. The shell hit the lead tank squarely, turning it into a blazing torch. In the same second, all the machine guns came to life, showering the trucks and the panicking German soldiers with a lead rain. The effect of surprise was absolute. The Germans weren't expecting this. They thought they were going on a safari, but they had walked into a fiery sack. But they quickly recovered from the shock. Their machine guns started firing, bullets clattering against the armor. The second tank, at the rear of the column, veered off the road and opened fire in return. A real battle began. Inside the armored train, there was a deafening roar. It smelled of gunpowder and hot metal. The men worked like a single mechanism. Loaders fed the shells, gunners locked onto targets in their sights, machine gunners mowed down the enemy infantry. Alyosha Vorobyov, the radio operator, sat by the useless radio, passing ammunition belts to the machine gunner. In the heat of battle, a German shell pierced the armor of the control platform. Shrapnel fanned out across the cramped space. Several men fell. Alyosha cried out and slumped to the floor. The battle lasted no more than 15 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. They had fired almost all of their ammunition. The enemy column was destroyed. The road was littered with the burning wrecks of vehicles. But the armored train had also sustained heavy damage. The locomotive's steam pipes were pierced, the running gear was damaged. It could no longer move. This was their last battle. The battle ended as suddenly as it had begun. The roar of gunfire subsided, and a heavy, ringing silence fell, broken only by the crackle of burning trucks and the groans of the wounded. The air filled with the acrid smell of burnt gunpowder, iron, and something else. Something terrible, nauseatingly sweet. Orlov pulled away from the periscope. The battlefield was a horrifying sight. A victory. An unconditional, crushing victory. But its price was immense. "Casualties?" he asked hoarsely into the tube. The answers came back slowly. 3 killed, 5 wounded. Among the wounded was Alyosha Vorobyov. Orlov went down into the car. Alyosha lay on the floor, someone's greatcoat tucked under his head. The medic was already trying to bandage him, but it was clear it was bad. Shrapnel had hit him in the abdomen. The boy's face was white as a sheet, beads of sweat on his forehead. He was breathing in shallow, rapid gasps. Seeing Orlov, he tried to smile. We gave it to them, Comrade Lieutenant," he whispered. Orlov knelt beside him, took his hand. It was cold and clammy. "Hang on, son. You're strong. You'll make it." But he could see life leaving the young body, like water from a punctured flask. At that moment, Kovalyov approached him. His face was black with soot. "It's bad, Commander. The locomotive is wrecked. The pipes can't be patched. And the undercarriage? We're not going anywhere. This is the end." Orlov was silent, looking at the dying boy. The end. Yes. This was the end of their steel fortress. Their 2-week odyssey had reached its finale. They had become a stationary target. Soon, new German forces would arrive, and they wouldn't be able to fight them off. Alyosha died half an hour later. He died quietly, without a groan, simply ceasing to breathe. His death became a symbol of the end of their epic. Their link to the mainland, their hope for rescue, had died. Orlov stood up. His face seemed carved from stone. "Bury the dead," he ordered. "Move the wounded to a safe place. Everyone else, prepare to destroy the train. Take all the weapons, ammunition, and food you can carry. We have 1 hour." The decision was difficult, but it was the only correct one. To abandon their home, their fortress, which had served them faithfully all these days, it was like killing a living creature, a comrade in arms. The men worked in silence with a kind of grim solemnity. They pulled machine guns from their mounts, carried out boxes of ammunition, took the last sacks of flour. Kovalyov and the sappers mined the locomotive and the artillery cars. They were preparing a worthy funeral for their train. An hour later, everything was ready. The dead were buried in a shallow mass grave under a spreading oak tree. Orlov gave a short speech. He spoke of how they had fought like heroes and that their feat would not be forgotten. But there was bitterness in his words because he knew that, most likely, no one would ever know of their feat. They were ghosts, and they had died as ghosts, leaving no trace in the official records. He looked at his men. Of the 46, 38 remained, exhausted, ragged, with faces black from fatigue and grief, but not broken. They had endured. "It's time," he said quietly. They retreated into the forest to a safe distance. Kovalyov lit the Bickford fuse, a few seconds of agonizing anticipation, and then the armored train shuddered from a powerful internal explosion. Fire erupted from every slit, the cars were torn apart, and a black column of smoke rose over the forest. Their home had ceased to exist. Now they were just a group of infantrymen lost in the enemy's rear. They turned and walked silently deeper into the forest, eastward towards a distant, ghostly front line. Their too-weak kingdom had fallen. They were nobody again. Months passed. A deep, snowy winter of 41 to 42 set in. In the forests of Ukraine, deep in the German rear, the partisan movement was flaring up. On one of the frosty December days, a partisan detachment led by a local forester came upon an abandoned winter lodge. There they found several men. They weren't men, but shadows of men. Overgrown, dressed in rags, terribly emaciated but armed to the teeth and with a cold, wolfish gleam in their eyes. They were commanded by a tall, gray-haired man with the face of a martyr and the gaze of a prophet. It was Lieutenant Orlov. Of the 38 men who had gone into the forest, only 7 had survived. The rest had died in clashes with punitive squads, from wounds, hunger, and disease during their long, arduous journey east. The fate of many remained unknown. Sergeant Zubov, the eternal pessimist, was one of the first to die, covering the retreat of his comrades. In his last moment, he had found the strength for a heroic act. Starshina Petrovich, the keeper of tall tales, quietly faded away from pneumonia, cheering the others with his stories to his last day. The strongest survived. Among them was Junior Lieutenant Kovalyov, whose engineering genius had saved them more than once in the forest. Orlov reported to the partisan commander about himself and his men. He told the story of the armored train BP-7. The commander, a seasoned soldier, listened to him with disbelief. The story seemed fantastic, like a fairy tale. No communiques, which they sometimes managed to catch on the radio, mentioned an armored train waging a partisan war in the enemy's rear. For the army headquarters, BP-7 had been burned or captured by the enemy back in September. Its crew was listed as missing in action. They were ghosts not only to the Germans but to their own side as well. Nevertheless, Orlov's men were accepted into the detachment. Their combat experience, their animal instinct, and their ability to survive in inhuman conditions proved invaluable. They continued to fight, now in the ranks of the partisans. They blew up bridges, derailed trains, burned enemy garrisons. The war for them was not over. After the liberation of Ukraine, the surviving crew members were vetted by SMERSH, the counterintelligence agency. Orlov spent a long and tedious time writing explanatory notes, compiling reports, trying to tell the officials the truth about the odyssey of BP-7. They listened to him with the same disbelief. His story did not fit into the official chronicle of the war. It was too incredible, too inconvenient. It contained not only heroism, but also despair, mutiny, and the brutality that had been necessary for survival. In the end, the case was quietly closed. The crew's feat received no official recognition. The survivors were simply allowed to continue serving in the regular army. Kovalyov made it to Berlin, became a renowned bridge-building engineer, and never liked to talk about the war. Lieutenant Orlov, having been promoted to captain, was killed during the assault on Königsberg in 1945. He was buried in a mass grave, one of hundreds of thousands without any special honors. He was buried in an old cemetery, and his story, it seemed, faded into oblivion with him. But, as the locals told it in the villages through which that abandoned railway passed, the memory of him remained. It was not written in the archives, but it lived on. Official history, as we know, is written by victors and bureaucrats. It has room for great battles, brilliant generals, and precisely calculated strategic operations. But it often leaves no room for the small, lost tragedies and incredible feats of ordinary people caught in the very epicenter of chaos. The story of the armored train BP-7 was erased from the official chronicles. It did not exist. The documents were lost. The witnesses were killed or silent. The armored train that for 2 weeks had been a fortress on wheels, a steel island of hope in the middle of a hostile ocean, was reduced to nothing, a blank spot on the map of the war. But human memory works differently. What official history erases is often preserved in legends, and the story of the ghost train became a legend. It was told in whispers by old railwaymen at small stations, passed from mouth to mouth by the inhabitants of the villages it roared past at night. They said it was an enchanted train, its crew made up of the dead, avenging their own deaths. They said its commander had sold his soul to the devil in exchange for invincibility. Among the German soldiers who served in that region, a belief persisted for a long time that at night, on the abandoned tracks, one could encounter the ghost of an armored train that appeared from nowhere and vanished into thin air. The story became a myth. It was embellished with incredible details, lost its names and dates, but it preserved the most important thing, its essence. The essence of the incredible strength of the human spirit, of the will to live, and of the fact that even one man, one small group of people, can continue to fight when it seems all is lost. Was their struggle worth such sacrifices? From the point of view of grand strategy, their 2-week war was merely a pinprick to the gigantic war machine of the Wehrmacht. But from the point of view of human dignity, it was a triumph. They did not surrender. They did not break. They did not turn into hunted animals. In the hell of total collapse and chaos, they managed to create their own small world of order, discipline, and comradeship. They lost their clash with the Great War, but they achieved victory in the most important battle, the battle for their own humanity. This story is not just a chronicle of a forgotten military episode. It is a reminder that true heroism often goes unnoticed. It is not found in the gleam of medals, but in the quiet, daily struggle for the right to remain human in inhuman conditions. And as long as we remember such stories, as long as we pass them on, the feat of Lieutenant Orlov and his crew will not be forgotten. It will live on, not in the granite of official memorials, but in our memory.